Hey everyone, welcome back to another advanced sports analytics application tutorial. In this video, we're going to be covering our NBA Inactive Pivot application. One of the, I think, biggest strategy points in NBA DFS is appropriately responding to inactive players, understanding what players stand to see minutes increases in response to certain players being ruled inactive. I think also understanding which players who will maintain similar minutes levels might achieve higher usage rates in the absence of other players, specifically like star players that play in the same rotation or same kind of unit as um, the inactive player that's ruled out. So the tool allows you to bracket by date. You have to start by selecting which team you want to view inactive trends around. So for this example, we're going to look at Indiana Pacers games in which Victor Oladipo is out. And by inputting Oladipo, you are able to see a table of different metrics that I guess we can explain here. So obviously, you have player name, you have the game played in overtime columns. These are just useful for understanding uh, in subsets or how many games and how many overtime games are in each subset. So the premise of the app is pretty much just looking at players' metrics for games in which player X, Oladipo, is inactive versus games in which player X is active. And really just looking at that and kind of net plus minus. So positive being, in this case, Aaron Holiday has a usage rate of 6.84% higher when Oladipo is inactive. Uh, you have other examples down here of guys with negative usage rates, but we're kind of trying to focus on guys who either have higher usage rates, higher minutes, and also just looking at what players kind of have the highest positive net fantasy points when Oladipo's inactive. So looking at games played is valuable just for understanding sample size. Cassius Stanley, rookie, I believe this year with Indiana, only has one game in which Oladipo is inactive. Understanding OT, I think, is also relevant, especially for small sample. I think it's yeah, understanding overtime, I think, is relevant. Just sometimes you see minutes, and with small samples, if you see positive net minutes, we want to make sure that that's coming from the player actually being inactive and not just a player playing a disproportionate amount of games into overtime when Oladipo's inactive. Oladipo's a large enough sample size where I'm not too concerned about that. But sometimes when you're looking at small sample, good to understand and make sure we're not looking at a set of players who have like a disproportionate amount of overtime games when that player's active. And then there's just these columns. So plus minus usage percent, positive meaning the player has a higher usage percent when Oladipo's inactive, negative meaning lower. Same goes for minutes. Usage percent times minutes. So usage percent is not a percent of entire game usage, but percent of possessions in which that player was on the floor that are used. So we can have players that have like 100% usage, but they only played 2 minutes. That's not really a player that's getting that much usage relative to kind of the whole game. So multiplying by minutes, I think, is a good way to control for some of those small minutes, I guess, usage cases. And then fantasy points total and fantasy points per minute. So we see like Aaron Holiday might be a guy to target as he has elevated usage, elevated minutes, uh, elevated fantasy points, and elevated per minute efficiency when Oladipo's inactive. Um, Brogdon, interestingly enough, actually has lower minutes when Oladipo is inactive. I find that interesting. Uh, I would have suspected the opposite. We got guys like Miles Turner, who Oladipo has, little his inactivity, I guess, has little to no effect. Is not really significant kind of difference in usage or minutes or fantasy points. It looks like Turner actually averages fewer fantasy points when Oladipo is inactive. Uh, Same for TJ Warren. So I think that's actually interesting. Oladipo might be a guy who, aside from kind of the direct beneficiaries, which it looks like Holiday is one of those guys, McConnell, um, some of these other uh, star players for Indianapolis actually seem to be hurt by the absence of Oladipo. So maybe he kind of makes that offense go. So I find that interesting. You can look at multiple inactive players in really one of two ways. And there's this inactive logic input where you can select counting inactive games, games that are part of this inactive set as games in which any of Turner or Oladipo are inactive. So maybe there's an upcoming game where both Oladipo and Turner are ruled out. Uh, we might want to look at relative performance, minutes, usage of players when either of these two guys are out, or if it is a set of players who frequently miss games together, we can type in all of, and it will consider the inactive set to be games in which both Turner and Oladipo were out in the same game. So it looks like, you can see when we do any of, we have a lot of these guys with over the past, year and a half, it looks like. We've had Holiday, Johnson, Sabonis, 40, 50 games in which either Oladipo or Turner have been out. When we do all of, we only have about a 10 game sample at most, really, for games in which both Turner and Oladipo missed. So the trade-off really is that you are getting smaller sample size when you select all of, but you are, I think, being a little more specific in terms of the games you want to measure some net or relative impact across. So that could be useful to use. And then, of course, selecting DraftKings or FanDuel scoring. You can look at the difference in player production minutes, per minute efficiency between the active and inactive set in one of two ways. The default is to look at raw or kind of scalar difference. So, when any of Oladipo or Turner is inactive, Aaron Holiday scores uh, on average plus 2.7 fantasy points more in these games in which either of Oladipo or Turner are inactive. You can also look at difference as a percent difference. So the idea, we can go back, I guess, to Holiday. He's down here. Is what we're looking at is not like Holiday scores, X points more, X points less, but his net difference is 17% higher. So um, I find this input or kind of way of viewing things to be a little less useful, but it can be, I guess, somewhat relevant across varying price points. So like we saw Bitadze up towards the top in terms of kind of net or scalar net fantasy points. It's worth noting just like his baseline is so much lower that I think it was what, two and change net points. Yeah, almost three, uh, +3 fantasy points for Goga. He is kind of a low baseline score, so that +3 points is 65% uh, above kind of his baseline when neither Turner nor Oladipo are out. That plus what 2.7 it was for Holiday. Holiday just naturally has kind of a higher baseline production. There's only plus 17%. So another way of viewing things, I guess, and kind of scaling the net differences relative to the baselines for players. So, you know, uh, percentage difference in fantasy points, percentage difference plus minus, percentage difference in minutes usage, fantasy points per minutes, stuff like that. So yeah, I find this app to be super useful in responding quickly to injury news and trying to identify players who stand to benefit from the injury or absence of specific players on a team. Obviously, works best for players and teams where there's kind of significant sample. It would be kind of difficult to look at the relative impact of, let's just say, James Harden being out on John Wall, just because there have been few games in which Harden has missed and Wall has played because they're new teammates. But it might be more useful for understanding kind of relative impact of, say, James Harden being inactive on Daniel House or PJ Tucker, Eric Gordon, stuff like that. Um, but we can use like placeholders or understanding, that John Wall has a similar role to that of maybe Chris Paul or Russell Westbrook. So by understanding the relative impact of Harden being out on, let's just say, Westbrook, we might be able to kind of piece together an expectation for the relative impact of Harden's absence on, say, John Wall. Same could be said maybe for like, uh, Christian Wood and Clint Capella, or Boogie and Clint Capella, something like that. So, another kind of creative way, I think, to use the application to make up for uh, player interactions or relationships that we have limited or potentially no sample on.